The door creaks open and a black woman, a slave, comes out of her master's room after midnight. She's crying silently, her body and heart broken. She has been abused over and over by her white master throughout the night. One day, the woman finds out she's pregnant. Instead of joy, terror fills her heart. She knows the truth: if her baby is born, it will grow up in the same cruel world she lives in, a world of pain, abuse, and no freedom. She decides to do something no mother should ever have to do. To protect her baby from a life of endless suffering, she chooses to stop the baby's life before it even begins. It's the most painful choice, but in her eyes, it's the only way to show mercy. This story isn't just about one woman. It's about the horrors so many black slaves faced, horrors too dark to be taught in schools. What was she saving her baby from? What made her feel this was her only option? In this video, we're uncovering the most disturbing things done with black slaves. This is black history that deserves to be remembered. In the dark history of American slavery, the unimaginable suffering endured by enslaved mothers often led to desperate choices. One of the most tragic and heart-wrenching acts was infanticide, mothers taking the lives of their own children as a final act of love and mercy. Imagine being a mother in a world where your child could be ripped from your arms at any moment and subjected to the horrors of enslavement. For many, the thought of their children enduring such a fate was unbearable. One story is that of Margaret Garner, who, in 1856, chose to kill her 2-year-old daughter rather than allow her to be captured and returned to slavery. After escaping from Kentucky with her children, Margaret was cornered by slave catchers. In a moment of despair, she declared that she would rather see her child dead than face the horrors of enslavement. Tragically, she succeeded in taking her daughter's life but was ultimately caught and faced severe punishment for her actions. Another heartbreaking account comes from Vicey, an enslaved woman in Missouri who smothered her newborn son, Stephen, in 1845. These stories were echoed in the oral histories collected by the Works Progress Administration during the 1930s. Many enslaved individuals recounted similar tales of mothers who chose death over bondage. One woman remembered how her friend, after losing 3 children to sale, killed her 4th baby rather than let it face a life of servitude. Infanticide among enslaved women was not only an individual tragedy, it was a community affair. Women often supported one another in these desperate acts, sharing knowledge about methods to prevent childbirth or end lives. The enslaved community understood the pain behind these choices and often kept such secrets from their masters to protect one another from punishment. The choice between life and death for their children reflects the profound psychological trauma inflicted by slavery. Another brutal practice was known as buck breaking. Primarily utilized against male slaves who dared to resist or defy their masters, the process involved severe public humiliation and violent sexual assault. Enslaved men were often stripped naked, forced to bend over a tree stump or similar object, and flogged mercilessly. This brutal beating weakened them, making it easier for the slave owner to commit the unspeakable act of rape that followed. This horrific spectacle was often carried out in front of other enslaved individuals, turning the victim into a public object of humiliation. The intent was clear: to break the spirit of not just the individual, but to send a chilling message to all who witnessed. The psychological impact was devastating. Many men who endured this trauma struggled with feelings of emasculation and despair, leading some to take their own lives rather than live with the shame. The practice of child breaking is one of the most tragic aspects of the history of slavery in America. Enslaved children were forcibly taken from their homes in Africa and subjected to a life of servitude, often stripped of their childhood and innocence. Once captured, these children endured a harrowing sea journey that lasted weeks or even months. They were crammed into tight spaces on slave ships, shackled and surrounded by the stench of sweat and fear. Many did not survive this journey. Those who did arrived in America traumatized and broken. Children made up about 26% of the captives on these ships, as they were seen as valuable assets for slave owners. They could be packed into the holds of ships like cargo, maximizing profit for those who trafficked them. The conditions were horrific. Many children suffered from malnutrition, disease, and abuse during this journey. Upon arrival in America, the breaking process began almost immediately. Child breaking involved not only physical labor but also psychological manipulation aimed to force them into submission. Former slaves recall how children were often sold multiple times, torn from their families repeatedly throughout their lives. This cycle of trauma created a generation that grew up knowing only fear and loss. Cutting ears and throwing slaves overboard were horrific acts performed by slave traders. And the reason this was done will shock you. During the height of the transatlantic slave trade, captured Africans were seen as goods to be bought, sold, or thrown away if needed. When enslaved people died on the brutal journey across the Atlantic due to sickness or harsh conditions, insurance companies often refused to pay captains for their losses. To get around this, some captains did something horrifying. They cut off the ears of those who had died to prove they had been thrown overboard. This was done to convince insurance companies that these people were not lost to illness but were thrown into the sea to lighten the ship, making it an acceptable reason to file an insurance claim. One of the worst examples of this cruelty was the Zong massacre in 1781. Captain Luke Collingwood, who commanded the British slave ship Zong, ordered more than 130 enslaved Africans to be drowned in the ocean. He claimed the ship was running low on water, but historians later found out the real reason. If the enslaved people died from sickness on board, insurance wouldn't pay. By throwing them overboard, he could argue it was necessary to save the ship, making it a claimable loss. Many slave ships were overloaded with more people than they could safely carry, right from the start. Captains knew this, but did it anyway to make more money. When the ships became too crowded and conditions too bad, they would throw people overboard to lighten the load, and then file insurance claims for the loss. Even more disturbing, some people were chosen for these voyages with the intention that they wouldn't survive. They were seen as disposable. The concept of human zoos is a dark stain on the fabric of humanity, revealing the depths of cruelty and dehumanization that people can inflict upon one another. One of the most notorious instances occurred during the 1889 Paris World Fair. Amidst the marvels of the Eiffel Tower and other advancements, visitors were drawn to a shocking attraction, a Negro village featuring 400 African inhabitants. These individuals were paraded as savages, stripped of their dignity, and displayed for the amusement of thousands. The event drew over 28 million visitors, who gawked at these human exhibits. Another heartbreaking story is that of Ota Benga, a young man from the Congo who was brought to America under horrific circumstances. In 1904, he was captured by slave traders and later purchased by an explorer named Samuel Verner. Ota's life took a tragic turn when he was exhibited at the 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis, Missouri, before being moved to the Bronx Zoo in New York City in 1906. At the Bronx Zoo, Ota was placed in a cage alongside an orangutan. Thousands flocked to see him, with signs labeling him as an animal rather than acknowledging his humanity. He was often treated with contempt. Visitors jeered at him and poked at his cage as if he were an exhibit rather than a person with feelings and dreams. For nearly 3 weeks, Ota endured this humiliation until public outcry forced his release. Moving on, plantation owners employed iron cages to punish those deemed disobedient. These cages were designed to confine the body tightly, causing prolonged physical pain and deep psychological suffering. These iron cages were not merely instruments of torture, they were tools of terror. Enslaved individuals found guilty of minor infractions or acts of defiance were often locked inside these devices, which left them unable to sit, stand, or lie down comfortably. Imagine being trapped in a space so constricting that every movement sent waves of agony through your body. Former slaves who shared their experiences during the WPA Slave Narratives Project recounted harrowing tales of confinement in these iron cages. Charles Ball, an enslaved man from South Carolina, vividly described witnessing fellow slaves subjected to this torment for days on end. He wrote about how they were left exposed to the elements, their bodies succumbing to muscle spasms, dehydration, and ultimately collapse. In extreme cases, individuals would perish from sheer exhaustion or exposure, their lives extinguished as a warning to others. Solomon Northup, who authored 12 Years a Slave, also shed light on the psychological torment inflicted by such punishments. He described being shackled in a pitch-dark cell for days. Lastly, seasoning was a cruel method that involved inflicting open wounds on the enslaved and then treating these wounds with salt. Salt, known for its ability to cause intense pain when applied to injuries, was used as a form of punishment. It was often mixed with brine, a solution strong enough to hold up an egg, creating a stinging sensation that would drive the victim into agony. Former slaves recounted these experiences in the WPA Slave Narratives Project, where one man described how he witnessed fellow slaves being punished by having salt rubbed into their wounds after being whipped. The intent was clear: to instill fear and discourage any thoughts of rebellion. One chilling account from Andrew Boone, who shared his story during the WPA interviews, illustrates this brutality. By this time the blood sometimes would be running down deer heels. Den the next thing was a wash in salt water strong enough to hold up an egg. Such punishments were often meted out for minor offenses like attempting to escape or simply being perceived as disobedient. Another harrowing incident involved a woman who was whipped until she bled profusely. A witness described how her wounds were then washed with brine to prevent infection and promote healing, an act that only served to prolong her suffering. The witness recalled, "There was a puddle of blood on the floor just as if a hog had been killed." This kind of torture was not isolated. It occurred regularly on plantations across the South, where overseers wielded power over the enslaved with terrifying cruelty. In addition to salt, other substances like lime juice and hot pepper were also used on wounds to amplify pain. As we reflect on these painful truths, it is vital to honor those who endured such horrors and recognize the lasting impact of slavery on generations. Understanding this history is crucial in acknowledging the resilience of those who survived and in working towards a future where such atrocities are never repeated. If you believe these untold truths should be shared, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. By subscribing, you'll help us uncover more forgotten stories and shed light on history that deserves to be remembered. Thank you for watching.